Hi, I'm BashFan. Today I'll be showing you how to create and provision virtual machines using Vagrant and Ansible. Our goal today will be to set up a simple network environment with a router, a server, and an admin workstation, all done with Ubuntu virtual machines. I'm going to be working on a Mac, but if you're using Linux, that should be just fine as well. You can also do this on Windows, but things are a little more tricky. I'm going to link to a video by Christian Lempa that'll give you some more information if you want to give that a shot. First, I'll talk about the tools we'll be using today. Vagrant you can think of as an alternate front end for your hypervisor of choice. It allows you to provision and manage VMs and containers using text files. It was released by HashiCorp in 2010, and they've been updating it since then. You can use it to provision VMs or containers with a text file and launch them from the command line. It works to control VirtualBox, Hyper-V, VMware, or Docker hypervisors, and I think a few others as well. And you can run it on Linux, Windows, or Mac. We'll also be using Ansible, which is a tool for controlling one or more remote hosts from the command line. It's released and maintained by Red Hat. You can run Ansible on Linux or Mac computers and use it to control all sorts of SSH-enabled devices, Windows workstations, Linux servers, routers, you name it. Ansible commands can be entered manually through the command line, or they can be automated using YAML files called playbooks. Finally, I'll talk about VirtualBox, which is the hypervisor we're using today. It's a Type 2 hypervisor, which means it runs as software inside of your host OS, as opposed to a bare metal or Type 1 hypervisor, which acts as its own operating system. VirtualBox is released and maintained by Oracle, and you can run it on Windows, Mac, or Linux. All of this software is free and open source, so as long as you have a relatively new computer that supports virtualization, you're good to go. I'm not going to cover how to install all of this software, because installation procedures will vary depending on your platform and what package manager you choose to use. With that said, let's get to work. Alright, let's get to work. The first thing we need to do is make a folder to hold all of our files that we'll be creating. I'm going to call it network env since we're setting up a network environment. You can call yours whatever you want. Alright, and we're starting with an empty folder. So now we need to create a Vagrant file, which is the file that holds all the settings we need to create our virtual machine. You could create this using Touch or just open up a new file in a text editor, but we're going to take a different route and run the Vagrant init command. And what's this going to do is just create kind of a generic default configuration file for us to use for getting started. One cool thing about this initial file is it's got a ton of comments, which is really helpful when you're trying to figure things out and learn what to do. So I'm going to go ahead and start deleting everything that we don't need. But if you're doing this for yourself, I recommend you actually read all this comments, and it'll really help you understand things. So this is what we're left with after deleting all of the commented lines that we don't need. I'm going to go through this line by line and explain what everything does. This first part here is defining what style of Vagrant file configuration or formatting we're using. There's two different format styles you can use, an old one or a new one. We're going to use the new one, number 2. Next, we're going to set up a do loop for the object config. Vagrant files are written in Ruby, so if you want to learn more about loops and objects, read up a little bit about Ruby. So next we are going to configure the actual base image that we're going to use for our box. This is going to be downloaded automatically when we run Vagrant file for the first time, and then in the future, when we run Vagrant file again, since the base image will already be downloaded, and we're not going to have to download that again. So for this video, we're going to be using the Bionic 64 image. It's an official image of Ubuntu 18.04, and it's released by HashiCorp. So we're going to just take that base and change it to Ubuntu/Bionic 64. So next we're going to do some networking. This line here is going to set up a new virtual network adapter on the guest. It's a private network, so that means it's only going to be accessible from the host machine, and we can specify the IP here. I'm actually going to change that IP to .56. Let's do 254, since this is going to be the gateway for our network. Finally, we need to specify which hypervisor we want to use, which in this case is going to be VirtualBox. And then we're going to set up another do loop for the object VB, and inside this do loop we can set any special configurations we want our hypervisor to carry out on our virtual machine. In this case, we're going to set the memory that we want our VM to have, and I'm going to bump this up to 2 gigs. And finally, we're going to end our 2 loops, and our file should be complete. I'm going to write it out and save. So now we want to test out our file to see if it worked, and the way we can do that is by running the command vagrant up, which should launch our virtual machine. Alright, it looks like that executed cleanly, and as one of my teachers used to say, no news is good news. Let's go ahead and see if we can SSH into this virtual machine. So I'm going to run the command vagrant SSH. Alright, we're in. Awesome. So if we look up here, we see that IP that we specified, that adapter was created, and there's also this second IP address which is created automatically, and that's used for communications between the host and the guest. I'm going to go ahead and exit out of this VM. Now let's say we were wondering if our VM is still running or not. We can run vagrant status, and it'll give us information about any Vagrant machines currently running. Alright, so it is running. If we want to take it down, we can run vagrant halt, and there we go. Our VM is shut down. So when we created that VM, it booted up with a default host name, and that kind of bothers me. And it could get confusing once we start creating multiple virtual machines. So let's go ahead and modify the Vagrant file so we can add a custom host name. So I'm going to insert a line here, do 2 spaces, and enter config.vm.hostname equals, and let's call this router, since that's what the machine will ultimately be used for. I'm going to write this out and exit, and let's see what happens if we run vagrant up again. Alright, vagrant SSH to get in again. Our host name has been updated. Excellent. I'm going to exit out of here, and let's get back into our Vagrant file so we can take the next step in our lab. So this isn't just a Vagrant video, this is a Vagrant and Ansible video, which means we need some way to integrate Ansible into this Vagrant file. So I'm going to add a line here that's going to tell Vagrant that we want to use Ansible for further configuration of our machine. So under the host name, I'll insert a new line. So here we're specifying that we're going to use Ansible to do further provisioning, and we're going to look for a playbook file called router.yaml. As I mentioned before, I believe, playbooks are the files that Ansible uses to automate series of commands. So now we need to actually create our playbook. So I'm going to use touch. And nano. So this is the YAML file that I came up with. The entire file is our Ansible playbook, and playbooks can be made up of one or more plays. So since these are YAML files, you need to be very careful with the spacing. One space wrong and it could break the whole file. Ansible playbooks always start off with 3 dashes, and then we can actually get into the meat of the file. And once again, I'll go through this line by line and explain what all of this means. So this first part here is the name of the play, which in this case is deploy. Next, we specify the host that we want to work on, and we're going to do this to any hosts or all the hosts that are created. Gather facts just tells Ansible that before we start all this, we want to gather some information about the machines that we're working on. Become true means that Ansible is going to be operating and carrying out these commands as the root user on each of the hosts. This section for handlers I'll talk about a little later. It's not going to make too much sense if I talk about it now. And then finally we get into the tasks, the actual processes that we want Ansible to carry out. Every task you can give a name, so you want to be just as descriptive as you can be. The name can be anything. In this case, we're going to be adding a repo into the sources list for the hosts, so that's the name I used. Next, we're going to specify the repo that we want to add. So we use this command, and then define the repo. And then here, state is something that gets used a lot in Ansible. State present just means that it's going to check and make sure that this repo is installed on the host. If it's already there, it's not going to reinstall it. Now we're going to get on to the next task, which is install. As you could guess, we're going to use this to install some packages. So we specify package right here, and in this case, we're going to use the state latest. So Ansible is going to check and make sure that we have the newest version of each of these packages. Next, we use name to define the packages that we want to install. It's always good to have some text editors around, so I'm going to install Vim and Nano. I'm going to install Nmap in case we need to do any port scanning later, and Tshark in case we feel like doing some packet analysis. Another reason I installed Tshark is because it gave me an opportunity to try out this command to add repos. Next, we're going to create a new user on the host that we're controlling. Let's see, I'm actually going to change this from Chris to BashFan. So again, this first part is just the name of our task, and then we actually get into the task, which is user for create user. So the name of the user is going to be BashFan, and again, state is going to be present, so it's just going to check and make sure that that user is created. It's not going to recreate it if the user is already there. Next, we're going to specify a password. We do that using this line here, and over here we specify what hashing algorithm we want to use. This line here, update password on create, means that it's only going to create this password the first time that we create our virtual machine. If we go back and run this Ansible playbook again after the VM has already been created, it's not going to reset the password. Finally, we're going to specify what shell we're going to be using by default. I'm going to set that to /bin/bash for this user, because of course, BashFan. So we've created our new user, but by default, this user will not be able to log in to this router by SSH using a password. To change that, we need to edit the SSHD configuration file, and that's what we're going to do with this task. To do this, we're going to use the line and file module. First, we need to specify the path, which is going to be /etc/ssh/sssd-config. This module is going to search for the regular expression password authentication, and if it finds it, it's going to replace that line with a new line, password authentication yes. If we don't find that line that we're searching for, password authentication, this insert after module is going to come into play. And what this module is going to do is search for a line containing hash password authentication, and then it will insert a new line after that. And again, it's the same line, password authentication yes. So after we've made these changes, we're going to need to restart the SSH daemon. So that's what we use this module for. Notify. So what this is going to actually do is it's going to notify a handler. I created that handler earlier in the file, so let's scroll up and look at it. The handler is going to be called restart SSHD. So here's the part in the file where I defined the handler. The name of the handler is going to be restart SSHD, and then we need to specify the service that we want to restart. So the name of the service is SSHD, and we want to ensure that the state is restarted. Finally, I'd like to add sudo rights for the new user that we created. So we're going to create a task called add sudo rights for bashfan. And to do this, we're going to use the copy module. And what that's going to do is it's actually going to create a new file at this destination that we're specifying here, /etc/sudoers.d/chrisvideo. And I'm actually going to change that to bashfan. And the content of this file will simply be bashfan all equals root, no password all. So I will have root access to all commands without having to enter a password. This last line, backup true, just means that if a file with that name already exists at this location, it'll create a backup file before overwriting it with a new file. So that's good in case we make a mistake. It'll be easy to restore the old version of the file. So I'm going to go ahead and write this out again, and exit. And let's go ahead and run Vagrant up again and see what happens. So you'll see here it's telling us that the machine is already provisioned, but we can run Vagrant provision to go ahead and manually provision it. So let's do that. Alright, and we can see it's running our Ansible provisioner. It's accessing the playbook, and it's executing the tasks that we've requested. So you can see here that it's actually making changes now. It added that repo into the source list as we requested, and now it's working on installation. Okay, our provisioning has completed, and here we get a play recap, which is just an overview of everything that Ansible has done. All 7 tasks that we requested were completed successfully, and out of those tasks, 6 of them resulted in changes to the host machine, and it looks like we didn't have any unreachable hosts and no failed or skipped tasks. So great news. Let's go ahead and SSH into our host and make sure that those changes were completed successfully. Alright, so let's see if the new user was created. It looks like our user was created and we were able to log in. Now let's make sure that Nano and Vim were installed. And how about the other applications? Alright, cool. And finally, let's just make sure that we can use sudo. Alright, we were able to use sudo without having to enter a password. Looks like everything is working great. So let's exit out of here and exit again to get back to our host machine. And finally, I'm going to show you how to delete a VM if you don't want to use it anymore. First we'll run our Vagrant halt, and then we can use Vagrant destroy. It'll ask us for confirmation. We say yes. Easy as that. Our VM is gone. We're back to where we started from, but we have our text files, so if we want to get that VM up and running again, it's only a few keystrokes away. So we've got our router created, but one router does not a network make. We need a couple more machines. To do this, we need to edit the Vagrant file again so that it'll make 3 machines when we run it instead of 1. To do this, I'm going to use vim. So the way we're going to do this, right now we have 2 nested loops. We're actually going to need to add a 3rd loop. So I'll show you how to do that. First we will enter insert mode. Here we go. So this is going to be our 2nd innermost loop for the item router, which is going to be our first machine that we're creating. And the rest of the stuff we can leave the same, but just change the indentation since it's nested a little further in now. Don't forget that every loop needs an end to match up with the do. That's our first machine created. Now I'm going to enter visual mode for a little copy paste. Okay, so we've got our loop set up for 3 machines here. Before I forget, we're going to need a final end here to make sure we close all our loops. And then I'm going to go in and change the machine names for the 2 new machines, and also the IP addresses. And one last finishing touch, our Ansible playbook, we were calling it router before, but now it's going to be configuring not just the router, but also the server and the admin. So I'm going to change the name to more accurately reflect what it's doing. Let's call it deploy, since that's really what we're doing. Now we're going to need to change the name of our YAML file. Okay, let's see if this works. Oh, silly me. I forgot to change the IP addresses. So for the server, let's use the address of .100, and for the admin, let's use the address of .10. I should mention now that all of these networks are automatically set up with a /24 CIDR. So since the first 3 octets of the IP are the same for all of the machines, they're all going to be on the same network. But you know what? I want to change that. I'm actually going to put the server on its own network so that later on we can create a DMZ. And that means that our router is going to need an additional interface that's on that same network. Okay, how's that look? Okay, let's give this a shot. Okay, it looks like everything worked, but it looks like I made a little error in the Vagrant file because it was running the playbook multiple times for some of those machines. But before we dig into that problem, let's go ahead and run Vagrant status just to confirm that all of our machines are up. Okay, so we've got 3 machines running. Let's SSH into a couple of them. Alright, we're in the router and we can see that all of those interfaces we set up are still here. Actually, we've got a couple extra interfaces here that we don't want, so again, I think that's with a problem in my Vagrant file. So let's get back into the Vagrant file and see what's going on there. Okay, I think I figured out the problem, and anyone who's sharp on Ruby probably already noticed this and was screaming at their TV this whole time, or their phone, or whatever you're watching this on. So I changed the name of this do loop to router, but I failed to change the object down here that we are iterating over. So what I need to do is, since we are now inside the do loop for the router object, I need to change this from config to router. So I'll do that for all of these. And of course we're going to have to do this for each of the VMs that we're creating. Okay, so this one is a server do loop, so these get changed to server. Alright, I think that's going to do it. Let's destroy our old machines. Alright, so we just created the router and it only ran the Ansible playbook once. So I think we're on the right track. Okay, we are done provisioning. Let's SSH into the router and see how our network settings look. Now that we have 3 machines, we need to define which one we want to log into when we run Vagrant SSH. Excellent. I only see 3 adapters here. The default one that's created automatically, and then the 2 that we specified. Great. And then let's check out one of the other machines. Only 2 adapters, as expected. And just for good practice, let's log into the 3rd one. Alright, let's verify that our user was created on this one as well. Alright, and we've got our custom user is present as expected. You know what? I have not demonstrated yet how to use the SSH to log in with the password. So let's check and make sure that that's working. Let's SSH into the router. And we should specify a user. We're going to say yes to this since we're connecting for the first time and it is a trusted machine that we're logging into. And we're in. We are able to SSH from one of our machines to the other one using a password to log in. This is all looking very good so far. And again, we'll run Vagrant status just to show that all 3 machines are indeed running. Okay, great. So I think we've made good progress today. We created our first Vagrant file, and we used it to generate 3 virtual machines, which we then configured with our Ansible file, our Ansible playbook. We've still got more work to do though. We need to configure the router to enable packet forwarding so it can actually do its job as a router, and I want to do some more custom configuration on each of the virtual machines. But this video is getting a little long, so I think I will save that for the next installation. So, until next time, this has been Bash Fan. Thanks for joining me. I hope to see you again soon.